Welcome everyone to the EU Exit Working Group. In terms of just some very quick messages for those watching on the webcast of today's meeting, the main item of business today is a discussion on Brexit and the next possible steps. We also have an update on the work on the London Resilience Forum. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussions using hashtag Brexit. Please make sure all electronic devices are switched off in silent mode and to avoid unnecessary interruptions. And before we come on to our main items, we've just got to deal with some of our formal business in terms of that. So item 1, apologies for absence. We've got Gareth Bacon has given his apologies, ably represented by Tony Devenish AM as the substitute. We've also received apologies from Peter Whittle in that sense. So let's move on. Item 2, declarations of interest. Can we note the declarations of interest listed on the agenda, and do any members have any declarations they wish to make at this stage? No? Okay, let's then look at the minutes of our last meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of February 2019 so they can be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much. Summary list of actions. Can we note the report?
Noted.
Okay, let's move on. Brexit next steps. We've got a briefing note. Can I welcome our guest for the first part of this session, Joe Owen, who's an Associate Director for the Institute of Government. Can we, in the sense that you're one of our leading experts and some of the work that we've been following, do you want to make a statement of where you think things are as an opening statement to us, and then we'll take questions from the panel to you direct? Is that fair?
Fine, I'm very happy to do that. So I think the first thing to say is that there are kind of three simultaneous pathways that are happening at the moment. There is pathway 1, which is the Prime Minister's deal, and whether that will come back, and there'll be a further vote on that in the House of Commons, and then move on to further ratification. Pathway 2 is the process that has been taking place in the House of Commons this week in trying to see if there's a majority for something else through the indicative votes process that, if successful, could lead to possible amendments to the political declaration, the future relationship element of the withdrawal agreement. And then the final track is obviously no deal, which remains on the table. The current kind of drop-dead date on that in international UK and EU law is the 12th of April. So at the moment, all these three tracks are happening. I think there are a number of challenges with each of them that I think we can probably get into. I'm very happy to talk about what I see them as now before questions, or we can dive into them in questions.
Yeah, just go for it.
Okay, so on track 1, the Prime Minister's deal, obviously there are three big challenges. One is getting the support, whether you have the kind of political backing for it. I am no expert on the politics, and anyone's guess is as good as mine, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. The second is just the procedural steps in actually getting it back into Parliament for a third vote. The Speaker, John Bercow, yesterday made his intervention suggesting that even if the House of Commons were to express a majority to say we want this deal to come back, he still wouldn't see that as sufficient in terms of procedure around not asking the House the same question twice. Now that's quite a big challenge for the government. That was one of the options I think that most people felt was a way through when he made his original ruling last week. But there are other options. One of the ones that has been spoken about probably the most is whether or not the withdrawal agreement bill, the piece of legislation that is required in order to ratify the withdrawal agreement under UK law, whether that could be used as a route to either overrule the EU Withdrawal Act, which is the piece of legislation that determines you need a meaningful vote, or provide amendments, and basically to use that as a way to bypass the meaningful vote process and move through to ratification. Now, the third challenge on the Prime Minister's deal I wanted to bring up was this withdrawal agreement bill itself. It's often considered that piecing together a majority to push through the meaningful vote is kind of done and dusted. There we are, there's a majority for the deal, but actually the legislation that will need to follow is certainly unlikely to be contentious. And actually, if you look back at the implementation of previous bits of EU treaty, actually the legislation has proved to be a pretty tricky process. So if you throw yourself all the way back to the UK joining, in our version, in the version of the meaningful vote, if you like, the kind of approval for joining the EU, there was a pretty big majority. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was close to 100 in favour of joining the EEA, as it was at that, or the EEC, sorry, as it was at that point. When you got through to the implementing legislation, that majority was down to single figures because of some of the challenges that, as they are written in UK law, may put off MPs who possibly agreed with it in principle. And then the other point is that there will be lots and lots more votes that the Prime Minister, the government, will need a stable majority for. For Maastricht, I think there were over 100 divisions, maybe 120 divisions on the piece of legislation. All of that from kind of second reading and approval of the bill in principle to actually some quite tricky amendments that could have consequences for our ability to abide by the agreement as signed up to with the EU, and therefore potential consequences for the EU's willingness to ratify. So the kind of broad point I wanted to make there is that the meaningful vote is not the last kind of hurdle. There are plenty of big parliamentary votes that are potentially just as important still to come in order to get through to ratification. The second track I talked about was the indicative votes process. What we saw last night, as you will know, is that there is not a majority for any of those options. And actually, what we saw is that there was maybe Labour and opposition parties' potential support for some softer types of Brexit, but Conservative Party voted against all of those, and where you saw a big a big kind of yes vote from the Conservatives was either around no deal or the kind of standstill transition, but leaving still without a deal that was put forward. So how you kind of reconcile those over the next week to come up with this stable majority still looks really difficult, and it's not as if there is an obvious answer that will come out of this process. The final track I talked about was no deal. I think despite big votes from the House of Commons, I don't think if you speak to officials working in government departments, don't think they've taken their foot off the gas in terms of the preparations that need to be in place for potentially leaving without a deal now on April the 12th. And that is a real challenge for how you give advice and communicate with businesses and citizens who will rightly be wondering what will change and when and by how much. And I think taking account of this huge effort that is still going on to try and prepare for no deal despite timelines being quite uncertain is a really important point.
And of course, behind the various paths, there is legislation going, isn't it? Your organisation back in January published about Brexit 2 months to go, I think, and then started to put red, green, amber, well, not much amber, of the different parliamentary acts that are required for various issues.
Yeah.
And that's not really changed, isn't it? So my question is that if we get past this week, well, this week, early next week, and there is something, right? Because even if Monday happens, there's further steps that those who want to take the indicative process and turn it into legislation would have to take. Time is running out, really, to pass the rest of any accompanying legislation that you need to do. You know, it almost begs the question, why aren't we in this position sometime last year of then giving us some breathing space to pick up those issues? In your view, is that still substantial? So let's play what if the Prime Minister's deal gets a majority on Friday, the timetabling to pass the rest of the legislation, can that still be done in the timescales that both EU and government have arrived at?
Yeah, so the legislation necessary for leaving depends on how we leave. So if we leave with a deal, in the scenario that you say that the Prime Minister's deal goes through and we're aiming for this May 22nd date, the only critical piece of legislation is this withdrawal agreement bill. That is what is necessary in order to ratify the withdrawal agreement, enter the transition, and then actually the other bills that are making their way through Parliament can come in during the transition. If we're to leave without a deal, then there is a raft more legislation, both primary and secondary, that would be required. And actually the government has been a bit inconsistent, and it's still not entirely clear which of those bits of legislation are absolutely critical for no deal and which ones you could live with putting in place in the weeks and months after. But one of the really problematic areas for them is the trade bill. So the purpose of the trade bill is to give the government powers to roll over the agreements that we are part of through our EU membership, the stuff that the Department for International Trade have been trying to agree, and there has been a kind of a steadier stream in the past few weeks and months of agreements that we've kind of reached in principle or somewhere slightly more detail. And what the House of Lords have done is passed an amendment to that saying this cannot come into force unless MPs vote for no deal. So the kind of accidental, or not accidental, but the default legal leaving doesn't mean that that would then come into place. And that is quite a problem for the government in getting its legislation through. If Parliament is saying we're not playing ball unless you let us give a kind of overwhelming support for no deal. So back to your question on timelines, if you're looking at the April 22nd scenario of leaving with a deal, I think that is still very tight for getting just the withdrawal agreement bill through. So I think there was something like 40 parliamentary sitting days used for passing the Maastricht legislation, and I think it was down to about 25 for the Lisbon Treaty. So it's still going to be relatively tight to try and get that legislation through. If the scenario and the timelines is leaving without a deal on April the 12th, if you look at where those bills are, and I don't know off the top of my head, but I don't think they're actually that much further on from when we've published that, we're still a very long way from having the necessary legislation, or at least all of those bills that government once indicated were necessary for no deal. We're still a long way from having those in place. And what the government has done for the last few months really is held them all back to try and avoid uncomfortable votes in the House of Commons. And there's nothing to suggest that MPs or Lords wouldn't start to lay similar types of amendments that they've done on the trade bill to those other bits of legislation. So I think under no deal it's much more problematic than it is in the deal scenario, but the deal scenario is not without big risks.
And just if I can pick up, so some of I think you yourself have published a paper about just taking one aspect of preparation by government for the Home Office. Is it the fit for purpose around migration issues? So I think your position is actually government. It needs to change. It needs to change how it does its work. I mean, do you want to just take us through that, because we might follow up on that, and because I mean the whole issue is just this opens up all sorts of issues. Even if you set aside Brexit, the role of the executive, the role of Parliament, both houses, because I think we haven't heard from the House of Lords except for that one vote. We know what the House of Lords is capable of doing in terms of that. The timetable, relationships, our government departments, are we able to move as quickly into that? We know when rushed legislation goes through, mistakes are made. Yeah. So in terms of, let's just hone in on terms of some of that work you did on the Home Office and preparations around that. What was your conclusions? What did you draw into that?
In some respects, the Home Office piece was looking much further ahead because actually the Home Office is one of those areas, at least in migration where we looked at, where the government could, I'm not saying it would be easy politically, but practically it could remove any kind of, for want of a better phrase, cliff edge where all of a sudden certain arrangements end and new ones need to begin. Because we could unilaterally say we want free movement to carry on for another year if we wanted to. If we didn't think that we had the necessary processes in place, we could make that unilateral decision. Where it's much more acute, where there will be a kind of legal and practical step change overnight in certain areas, is around the border. So I've also done a bit of work there. So perhaps if I use that to illustrate some of the challenges around government departments working together in timelines. The border is one of those areas where things will change on day one legally. We will become a third country as far as the EU is concerned, and the EU has a long list of rules that we've been applying for a long time about how you treat third countries with whom you have no trade agreements at the border. In terms of the UK side, we can make some unilateral decisions to say, for trade coming from Europe to us, we're happy to wave stuff through, we'll take a pragmatic approach, we don't want to insert too much friction in the border, which is a possible temporary fix, but longer term isn't sustainable given where we will be negotiating with other countries around the world and possible challenges at the WTO for our approach at the border. But this is one of the biggest practical tasks for the government, is preparing the border. And if you look at the number of departments and agencies, I think it's just under 30 different governments and departments or agencies have a role at the border. Everything from kind of DEFRA, doing checks on animal health, to obviously HMRC doing stuff around customs. But then you have these public bodies. I mean, I remember when we looked into it, I was very surprised that you have the Forestry Commission, who are responsible for issuing phytosanitary certificates that are necessary for entering the EU and trade with other countries. You have the Government Diamond Office, who potentially need to play a role for specific goods. The Arts Council have a role for certain things, and obviously they are bigger or smaller depending on what they are, but the cross-government task is huge because we have the way that our key trading routes with the EU are constructed, and when we went round and spoke to people, when we did a paper in 2017, I think it was, they said it's constructed to be a continuous motorway, that although you kind of change mode of transport, we want you to be as free-flowing as possible all the way, and they've optimised space for that. So if you need to insert checks somewhere there, then the knock-on effect could be quite substantial. So if you have to conduct checks, but one of the government departments isn't ready and don't have the necessary people or processes in place, all of a sudden that can have quite a big knock-on effect to how the others operate. So government has actually taken some pretty positive steps in trying to join this up. They established a thing called the Border Planning Group, which was the senior officials from all of the relevant departments and agencies, and then the Border Delivery Group, which had a specific role at trying to deliver this. But when we spoke to people across government about this issue again, about this time last year, they said that there was this real issue of how you got things to line up, because in one respect, there are also different ministers involved in these different areas, and some of the different ministers, as you will have seen no doubt from various briefings in newspapers about the Cabinet, have got different views of where things should go and where priorities should be, and some of that does make it difficult to come up with a kind of single coherent plan, particularly when there is no single minister sitting in Cabinet who's responsible for the border, who can be the person to say, no, I am making an executive decision, this is how it will run. And that was one of the challenges that came out, just the political tension. The other is clearly just the time frames. So in 2012, we adjusted one of our systems in line with EU law at the border to basically introduce a new piece of paperwork called an entry summary declaration. And from the point at which that piece of system was ready, and I think it took possibly a couple of years to get it all up and running, we then gave businesses 18 months before they had to comply, and before they would then basically be turned away at the border if they didn't have the right paperwork. We've had 3 years from the referendum until now. If you look at one of the big systems that they're implementing at the moment, the Customs Declaration Services, big IT system involved in the border, I think that will have been running for 7 years. And so these changes take time, not just from government to work out what it wants and what the right systems are to facilitate it, but how you get traders and businesses up and running. We know from loads of government projects that that is often the most difficult bit, whether it's making tax digital, which is running at the moment, which has had to be kicked back, I think, a few times because of difficulties engaging with small businesses, or automatic pension enrolment, where actually I think there was some businesses were given 6 years to prepare with constant communication about what's needed. And so where we are now is that communication began, I think it's not really fair to say it began in earnest in terms of broader communication in August last year, with a bunch of technical notices that were kind of plonked on the government website. And I think if most people who have done big change in government say that is not the way that you get everyone ready. And while there has been some much more focused and detailed engagement, and I'm not saying that the government hasn't been doing this, they have really struggled. And actually there was a really telling piece of evidence that the lead officials who were in charge of the border gave to the Public Accounts Committee in Westminster a few weeks ago, where they were saying, we just haven't been able to engage, particularly with businesses, say, in Northern Ireland. We've just been told by ministers that we can't talk to them about it because it's too sensitive. And so the politics and the practicalities and the tension between them have been real difficulties in actually getting some of the necessary communication out.
And so much that our legislation process has been exposed by this challenge, our capacity to respond, whether it's at policy level or implementation level, will need, whatever happens post-Brexit, probably redesigned at some sense. It will be a different civil service or a different government approach is required if it's going to meet the challenges that we face post-Brexit. Is that
I
the
think
general
that's,
conclusion of where it ought to be? Or?
That's certainly true in some areas. So I think there is a serious question about whether having the border so fragmented, responsibility for the border so fragmented through government is the way that we will continue to work, or whether these border delivery group, the border planning group, actually becomes much more of a set part of government infrastructure, if you like. And then one of the other areas that we talked about was immigration, where we did say that longer term there is a real argument for a big rethink, because the way the immigration system works now, there is a big change by introducing the end of free movement. There's a big change from a policy perspective, because previously we've been able to rely on free movement, whether you're for it or against it, as a policy lever. It's basically been a safety valve. So if the government restricts immigration in certain areas and for certain professions too much, for non-EU migration, they always knew that EU migration would be able to kind of pick up some of that slack. So there's a different policy question that will require different government departments to come together in a different way to answer the big trade-offs in a way that free movement has kind of allowed them not to do. There's also a big delivery question. So again, take immigration. We're simply just introducing many more people who will have to come into contact with the immigration system by introducing, by free people who come here under free movement having to go through the Home Office processes, just capacity-wise, that's a big burst. And then the other argument that we made on immigration was just public confidence, that when you look back at some of the challenges the Home Office has faced, whether it's Windrush, DNA testing in the past, there is an argument about whether it is the right construct to inspire public confidence, both domestically and for people who will be looking to come here, and whether that was an argument for rethinking.
Okay, do you want to come in on this point? Because I've got two other non-related issues that I just want to explore. Do you want to
I want to go back. I've got a point that goes back to the beginning.
Well, if I just deal with mine very quickly. Tomorrow I think you're publishing some, or your organisation is publishing a piece of work around what's changed in government since the EU referendum. Are you in a position, I know it's a bit cheeky to ask, to just to give some headlines that you think might well be coming up tomorrow in terms of your publication of your document?
Yeah, so what we do is, it's drawing on some of our past work, but basically saying what's changed in the past 2 and a bit years. How's Brexit changed government? And I think there are probably 3 interesting bits: civil service, ministers, and then Parliament. In terms of civil service, just pure size and scale, I think there are 14,500 officials working on Brexit as we stand now, and actually all of the indications is that that will just continue to increase in certain areas. So take DEFRA as a really good example. After 2010, I think they lost about 1 in 3 staff through the kind of spending reductions that were delivered under the coalition government. Within about 18 months, I think 2 years after the referendum, that's just been totally reversed. It's just, you look at the chart and it just goes whoosh, straight up after the referendum. So that's a big change for that department and the role of that department. Likewise, Home Office, those cuts have been reversed. So size-wise, it's a big question for the civil service. Then quickly on ministers, what we pull out is actually there has been increasing strain in the ministerial civil service relationship, actually, in some areas where you've seen ministers being quite critical of the civil service. You can take kind of Ollie Robbins as chief negotiator as a bit of a lightning rod, but actually there were things said about the Treasury and their role in financial analysis and the economic analysis. So that's relationship is coming under strain in a way that perhaps hasn't in more recent history. And then the other point is about this thing on resignations, where we've seen a kind of party discipline from a ministerial perspective, particularly in recent weeks, change in a way that again is unprecedented in recent memory. And I think, I can't remember how many now, I think there are 5 ministerial posts that are still empty because people have resigned. And actually, if you look at people who've already resigned or have voted against the deal and showed opposition to the deal, the pool of people who are potentially eligible to be a minister is actually quite small. So that kind of tension is there. Then on Parliament, I think that we've seen tons of things that are unprecedented around the use of the humble address originally to force information out of government, and then more recently these indicative votes where you could argue that it's not uncommon for Parliament to decide what it wants to talk about and what it wants to debate. But those are usually on kind of carefully allotted days, not by taking control from the executive for a certain day, and certainly not to carry out a series of votes that are different to the government's single biggest policy that it's been working on for the last couple of years. So that tension is partly a reflection of my life in a minority government, but there's a real question about the extent to which that continues. And sorry, the one other point I'd make is around devolution, particularly with the nations, that relationship has come under a lot of strain, particularly with Scotland, because the way that devolution was done. I mean, devolution settlements were made where you had a Labour government in each of the countries, and you had the EU framework to say, we'll give you control over environment, agriculture and fisheries, but we can do that knowing that the EU sets the outer bounds. And when you remove that outer bounds from leaving the EU framework, how the four nations work together to ensure that they don't diverge without it being seen as Westminster then saying, well, we're going to curtail your ability to make decisions for yourself in these areas. That's a real problem, and we've seen a lot of friction, particularly with the Scots and the Welsh, and then obviously there's the question of Northern Ireland where there hasn't been an executive. So those are some of the big challenges that we touch on.
Okay, what we're going to do, we've got an hour allocated for the next part of the session. I think we should take 3/4 of an hour for that. Joe, you're able to stay behind if there's further questions, if you could bear with us. It's very useful. Let's continue on. So, Caroline Russell and then Tony Devonish.
Yes, I want to go back to sort of the beginning when you set out that we had 3 simultaneous pathways, and you've really talked quite a lot about pathway 1, which is the Prime Minister's deal. You've talked about no deal and preparations both either for the Prime Minister's deal or no deal. What we haven't heard much about is this process of the indicative votes. Now, I'm just interested to understand where you think that could end up, whether you think that there is any opportunity that we might get a vote put back to the people, just whether the pathway 2 could actually be a way through the impasse that you've been describing to us.
So the first thing to say about pathway 2 is we don't actually know what happens next. We don't know what will happen on Monday. We know that there will be an attempt to try and whittle down these options, but the exact process and procedure, I think, unless something's changed and I've missed it, is still unclear. But there were the kind of 3 options that received the most votes last night were a confirmatory referendum, a customs union, which was the closest in terms of majority division, and then Labour's alternative plan. I think that the first question is, if any of those were to be successful, what does that mean? I mean, first of all, there's the question of whether the government will accept it and whether they will use that to go back to Brussels or to change the process. But then the second question is, are they negotiable? What do they actually mean? Could we actually come up with an agreement? This isn't just about Westminster deciding what it wants, but also coming up with something that is negotiable with Brussels. So obviously only 2 of those 3 options would require negotiation. The confirmatory referendum would require negotiation, I guess, only in as much as we would need a much longer extension in order to be able to...
Would we then... Could you see a scenario where we ended up holding the EU elections?
I think it would be... I don't want to nail my colours too hard to us, but almost impossible to see how you would have another referendum without
holding
EU Parliament. In fact, I think it actually would be impossible. Just if you look at the timelines in current legislation, this could change, but there is the time required to pass the legislation for another referendum, which would need, I think the Electoral Commission have suggested they would want at least 14 weeks to test the question. And then there is the kind of regulated campaign period as set out in UK law that we would need to take account of. So I think when we did a piece of work that said if you took the Electoral Commission's assessment and the campaigning period as is in legislation, with a little bit of time, if you assumed there was a whopping majority for this and it could just breeze through Parliament, which I think is a big assumption, you could possibly get it done in 21, 22 weeks, which is very similar to the Constitution Unit, who did a piece of work on this. So yeah, I think it's very, very difficult to see how you would escape the European Parliament elections. And also, if Remain was on the ballot paper, you would not want, not taking part in the European Parliament elections would make it very difficult to then actually choose to remain.
So if this is still something that is in play, then holding the EU Parliament elections, am I right, the 11th or 12th of April, which is our current cliff edge no deal point, that's the deadline for holding those elections. How prepared do you think that this country is for actually holding those elections? Is that part of the government's Brexit preparedness?
So I've got to admit, I haven't asked or spoken to officials directly about whether or not this is being worked on. I think there were obviously there were points made after Theresa May's second attempt with her meaningful vote a few weeks ago was unsuccessful, that she told the Conservative Party that they would need to be ready for these elections. Whether that's just briefing, I don't know. So, I mean, the short answer is it's very difficult to tell, but the purpose of that April the 11th is that we then have sufficient time afterwards to do some of that organisation and then have the 5-week campaign period. So I wouldn't say, I don't think I'm in a position to be able to say definitively either way, but you would assume it features in planning, given that it is now a relatively realistic prospect.
Thank you.
Tony.
Joe, do you have somewhere in all your research a very simple flow diagram of who actually is supposed to be doing what by when? I know you probably haven't got it all, but are you publishing one in your paper tomorrow?
So when you say who needs to do what, who being the
Which department, which bit of local government, what the mayor's meant to do, really a kind of I'm a great simple believer in a nice flow diagram.
Yeah.
If you haven't got one, would you draw one up for us subsequently, please?
I have no idea how you would go about doing that. I think it is extremely complicated, and the interdependencies between the different departments and the different layers of government are pretty dizzying. So I think the closest that you could get to that kind of flow diagram probably exists in one of the darkened rooms in Whitehall in the Department for Exiting the European Union, on one of their huge mega Gantt charts, trying to articulate it, because I think it is, this is one of the problems of just planning this kind of change, given the interdependencies and where the different responsibilities lie, it's a really big challenge. So we know that I think at last count, although it may have been updated, there were 313 Brexit work streams across government that the Department for the Exiting the European Union was monitoring. Some of those within departments will splinter out again into a number of work streams, which will then be required to engage with local or devolved government, which also then you have businesses and citizens the other side of that. So, this as a planning task is, I think, pretty unprecedented for government. And so, yeah, I'm sure there are lots of people who would love to get their hands on the simple flow diagram, but I think I certainly would never want to suggest that I could come anywhere near drawing up one that was accurate and complete.
Maybe I'll ask the Deputy Mayor later if she wants to draw one up. Have you got a list of the 313 work streams?
So this is a really interesting question, because the government hasn't released them. And one of the interesting things about this planning project, this big preparation project, if you were to compare it to another major project in government, other major projects in government, you have the Infrastructure Projects Authority, who will do regular reviews. You have transparency about exactly where the money is going and what is red, amber, green, and how ready we are ahead of each work stream. We don't have that information, particularly around no deal. It's one of the striking things about, the votes on no deal that took place. wherever you stand on no deal, from a kind of it's going to be better for us long term than the deal, or actually it would be a disaster for the economy. If you take that for one side, one of the things that was really missing in that conversation is, are we ready? Of the £2 billion that has been allocated for government departments to have spent by the day after tomorrow, I guess, since Brexit, where's that money gone? And of those projects, those that we thought needed to be ready by the end of March, how many of them are ready or not? We don't have that information, even the basic information about what the work streams are, we don't have. So I think that's one of the areas that it is quite remarkable that there is such little information on about just readiness in the way that you would expect for the Olympics or HS2 or the Thames Tideway Tunnel, these things where they would publish red, amber, green ratings. We just don't have that information.
Thank you. My final question is, when I ran large infrastructure projects, when I used to have a proper job before I became a politician, we do what's called red team review, i.e. get experts from a wide range of backgrounds, often retired chief executives or equivalent senior technical engineers, and we'd actually try and do some analysis of what in the plan has been missed out and how will the plan work. Has that been done at all?
So there are reviews similar to that happening within government as government officials, not externally. So the Cabinet Office have set up a thing, the name of it may have changed, but it was called the Functional Support Team, that said, okay, we know that we have got experts in project management from the Infrastructure Projects Authority, we've got HR specialists, we've got tech specialists, so let's bring them in, and if we think there's a project that's struggling, we'll bring some of these top resources from across government in to have a look at it, see what it needs to try and fix it, to get it through. I think those projects that have been part of that process, at least when I'd spoken to them quite a number of months ago, admittedly quite positive about it. But the bringing external people in, that hasn't happened as far as I'm aware, with the exception of some, not in a kind of red team review. There have been areas where engagement on policy has been better or worse. I think actually immigration is one of the areas where it's been better. But there, for stuff particularly around the border, if you speak to businesses who have been kind of relatively closely contacted, it's all, NDAs, not allowed to say what's happening, and they feel quite constrained in what they can and can't say in engagement with government, and have relatively little sight, I think, on exactly where government is.
Thank you very much.
Now, do we want Joe to stay? Have we got some further questions to Joe? Because if not, we can release you. I've got just one.
Okay.
Look, I think confidentiality, and you touched on it slightly, is important for government to go about its business, but equally transparency issue is, has anything come across this non-disclosure agreements with the private sector and probably in terms of the public sector? This lack of consistency in confidentiality, I think, is the key here in terms of what's going on. Have you got a view on that? Because we're going to be asking our colleagues in the resilience bit of what their take of it is and whether they've come into contact on it. So can you just give us a view around that, around the issues of governance and about... I mean, I do think confidentiality is important, but I'm not sure in these circumstances why. And what's the thinking that you can sort of cast a light on?
So I think the question is, what is it for? There's, I think, as you say, there's perfect logic in having confidentiality agreements if you're in early stages of policy and you want to test it out with experts that it will affect without it becoming seen as the defined government policy, and you want to use it in that early process. But I think there's a different point, which is if it is when you are 4 months away from having to implement something, and people who you are speaking to about what might change, you're speaking to only under confidentiality, and loads of other people have no idea what's going to happen and when, I think that's a very different issue. And the problem of transparency has been a real issue around Brexit. Again, I don't disagree that confidentiality will be important for testing out ideas in the early stage, but with so few people aware of what may or may not change, so close to the point at which it might change because of excessive secrecy, is a real problem. And it's also had problems inside government with departments not being able to share information with one another. And this, the 313 work streams, the big Gantt chart that exists somewhere, Brexit is a massive coordination task. And if you're telling people that only a small number of very senior people can read important planning documents by turning up to specific darkened rooms in Whitehall between specific times, and they cannot take the information away with them, that's a real problem for how you coordinate, particularly when you're involving the devolved assemblies or just public bodies who aren't anywhere near Whitehall and they can't have access to the reading rooms. So these are problems that government, I think, has grappled with. If you speak to people, they say it has got better recently, but there was a point where when planning guidance was issued for the 313 work streams to say, these are the 3 scenarios you need to work for, these are the basic assumptions behind each scenario, this is what you need to work to. That planning guidance was available essentially in a small number of reading rooms or permanent secretaries' offices, and you couldn't take it away. So if you're one of the kind of thousands and thousands of people working on this in Whitehall, I think 80% of what DEFRA does is framed by EU law, so a huge amount changing. But the planning parameters, you have to go and wait outside your permanent secretary's office to have a read through and you can't take them away. That's a real problem. And I think, as I said, it has got better, but that is one of the things that you hope will be fixed around the next phase. If we were to leave with a deal and we start negotiations again, that communication between departments gets off on a better foot.
And it's clearly got implications for the future, isn't it? I mean, for NDAs is a modern version of the Official Secrecy Act that used to be signed for all sorts of bizarre issues and for the right issues as well. So I accept that. But in terms of when you have the Home Office come back and say they refuse to answer how many NDAs they have because it's too burdensome to answer, when actually in reality out in the ether it's about 100, but they can't bring that figure in itself. It just seems absurd.
Yeah.
We've got the Department of Transport doing 79. I mean, I think it's interesting about, no one, like I say, there is a need for confidentiality to a certain level, but this inconsistent nature of it. Do you think this is one of the issues that's going to be picked up as the odd and bizarre governance issues in this country that we've encountered that actually does work against good planning, good implementation? Because that's what it is a barrier to, I think, in terms of that. Do you think that's going to be picked up?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to say without going through on a case-by-case basis almost. But I do think, so trade is an interesting area when it comes to engagement and NDA, and actually how you use businesses in trade negotiations, whether that's with the EU in the next phase or with countries around the world. And actually, it's quite important to have business able to see what you're trying to negotiate and be able to comment on what you're trying to achieve for 2 important reasons. One is that as bright and as great as officials are across government, having someone sat in the Department for International Trade making a decision, for example, on different bits of farm regulation that we will or will not sign up to, when you don't speak to the individuals who actually different bits of those regulation may be a huge part of their business model or not, and changing them can have a big effect. You need to be able to have that conversation and bring that expertise in. And then the second important point with businesses is they're kind of an important reason we're doing trade agreements in the first place, because you want to open up routes for trade and you think it'll have preferential access for your businesses. And one of the big problems if you look at trade agreements internationally is that governments go away, they have their big negotiations, they're nice signing ceremonies, and it's all great, but people don't actually know what's in the trade agreement. So loads of businesses trade without ever taking advantage of the preferential terms that have been agreed, because they have no idea that they've been agreed. They don't know what's in them. So how you bring businesses in to ensure that they can make the most of agreements is a really important question, and we will need to fix that, because the closed, secret nature of the way the negotiations have been constructed in phase 1 could have big complications when you start to discuss the trade elements in more detail in phase 2 or with other countries around the world.
Yeah, I just listening to this, I mean, we know that the British social attitudes surveys are now showing a majority of people in the UK would actually vote to remain now. So this hiding of information of the sort of impacts and details of all the negotiations, the things that might change.
Yeah.
Do you think that that actually, if that was more public, that you would actually be seeing very different responses to those to that kind of polling that's going on?
I think it's very hard to tell. I don't pretend that I can read public opinion or predict where it will go. I think that arguably people have probably had quite enough of Brexit headlines, so whether information about planning progress, etc., would make a big difference to the kind of general public is a question. But I think there are probably lots of businesses who are trying to engage with government who would benefit from actually understanding where government is, and whether that may change their mind or not will probably depend on actually where government is. It's quite hard, government could say, here's all of the stuff that we've done for no deal, and we're actually quite prepared for no deal, and it make people feel more assured by it. I mean, that is one possible outcome. Or it could go completely the other way. So it will depend on what government actually says. I don't think I'd like to kind of guess at which way it would go.
Yeah.
Look, Joe, thank you very much for that contribution. You don't need to stay for the next session, but you're welcome to if you want to observe. We're going to be looking at London's continuing preparations for various issues arising out of Brexit, including no deal. But we certainly might like to have you back. And I think one of the issues that come up that we ought to consider is Richard Durecki, advisor to this committee, has said maybe we should try and bring back the National Audit Office to come in and give a view. And we've had a private briefing with them, but I think it might be the right time to, because I think there are all sorts of lessons, and certainly post-Brexit, whatever it looks like, is going to require some changes, both in terms of how we go about our business, but also the people that do it.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'll be very happy to come back.
Love to,
Really
yeah.
good.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you, very good.
informative.
Can I now welcome Fiona Twycross and John Hetherington just to update us on London's preparations around that. Is there anything you want to say to us in the beginning since the last time that we met, or should we go straight into questions? I know you're on a tight time scale. I'm going to try and get you away for the time you wanted to get away for.
I think we really feel that the situation isn't much clearer than it was last time we came. And actually, listening to your previous guest, actually a lot of what he said around information and secrecy relating to government really rings true. I mean, we were sitting in the audience nodding while he was speaking. So I think the main issue from our end in terms of the planning is that piece around government, the fact that government is effectively in chaos, very large amounts of secrecy within and between departments, and actually the continuing jockeying for position at a sort of most senior level among the ministerial team is hampering civil servants from actually doing the job that we believe that they would like to be doing, both in terms of providing the information, but actually it is a complex task, as was discussed by the previous speaker, and anything that puts barriers in the way of information getting out and those information flows and people working constructively together on what is without doubt the most complicated constitutional issue any of us will see in our lifetime, or at least we can hope it is, that actually all those barriers that are being put in place are unnecessary and are sort of causing issues for everybody at every single level in terms of planning and finding a way forward.
Okay, I mean, if I can just pick up, I suppose, before we start around Got questions. On the issues of the non-disclosure agreements, is this something that has been helping or hampering sort of London's preparations? Are you aware of any of the private sector, well, the national organisations? I've seen an whole number of those, but in terms of that, has it come up in conversations of creating, is it my view of creating this insider-outsider? That's why I think what are barriers coming up is, you know, there are clearly things that do need to be held, but I just want to clarify this and see, you know, is it holding us back? Is it an issue? Because I'd like to pick it up at some stage.
I think with the non-disclosure issues, where there is no business need, I mean, you referred to them sort of effectively replacing sort of people having to sign the Official Secrets Act. Where there is no business need, or for people to sign them, or where there is a clear business need for the information to be shared, the non-disclosure issues are causing a problem. And it's not just business or other organisations, actually members of the London Resilience Group staff have had to sign them. The Resilience Forum has a duty to warn and inform. We've got a duty to work with partners, and actually where we're being told that we can't share documents with partners or who may be involved actually in the very sort of detailed contingency planning. So these are people who are actually sort of taking a very lead role in contingency planning for Brexit, where we are being told that we cannot share information with them. This is clearly an issue. And I think that the flow of information continues to be to government, not back to local areas. And we do have a situation in which many partners in local resilience forums will be finding out more from the media than they will direct. So, for example, following quite a prominent leak in the Observer at the weekend, I wasn't involved in the conversation, but I do understand that one local resilience forum asked if they could share the document that was effectively published by the Observer, and two partners, because obviously partners were asking if they could actually have a copy. They'd been told no, and then it was in the media, and they were told that because the leaked document wasn't the most up-to-date version, they couldn't. So there's two issues there. One is people obviously then all read the out-of-date version that was published in the media, and you actually start breaking down trust within, potentially. I mean, I don't think it's a case in London, but you've got the potential of people thinking that some people are holding information that they need in terms of their planning, and actually at the heart of strong resilience forums at a local level should be that trust between partners and ultimately the trust between government and local resilience forums. And I would add that if it was an out-of-date version of the document, it definitely wasn't a local resilience forum that leaked that document. So the issue in terms of confidentiality, in my view, in terms of government documents, is not from local resilience forums sending them off to the Observer. That leak clearly came from somebody who had access to it within government.
Okay, John, do you want to add anything to it? Because you're an official in the sense of having to deal and wrestle with these issues on a day-to-day basis. So do you want to?
Yeah, so as the Deputy Mayor said, our absolute premise and duties across all of our responders is to share information and cooperate with each other. They are laid down duties under primary legislation, and we're being inhibited from doing so. So to sign non-disclosure acts, even in the way that we're asked to sign them on behalf of a resilience forum, which is a non-legal entity. So how can you sign a document on behalf of a non-legal entity? So we had to, it slows down the whole process of taking legal advice, working out who you can and can't share with, and just becomes overly bureaucratic and unreasonable, really. Yeah. And it inhibits our ability to pass that information on in a coordinated way and make sure that everybody is on the same page. I think a lot of the issues were explained earlier, just the scale and size of this and the secrecy that surrounds some of the issues really do hamper and don't allow people to understand the full range of issues that we're looking at, that it is no longer about contingency plans being in place. It is about adaptation to a new normal of the entire motorway system, as it was put earlier, being able to change with everybody understanding their part in that. That's nigh on impossible without the ability to share information openly and freely.
what worries me is, and I can only go on what I've read in the media in that sense, is the cavalier approach to a very serious issue. Because there are times when things need to be kept confidential. And if it's used inappropriately and everyone feels, hold on, we need a bit of common sense here, then it's going to be broken. And there will be times when it's broken on much more serious issues that do need to remain confidential. And so I'm slightly worried about this sort of, you rush out this sort of multi-numbers of it that almost stop the important things that you need to protect and is right to be kept confidential to the things that don't need to be kept confidential because they stop people planning or contributing in the right ways. I mean, we may pick this up further because I think there are some issues and we've all grappled with issues of, particularly of us, those in local government, have grappled with what remains confidential and what doesn't in terms of transparency at a local level. For us, I mean, I can't speak for the committee, but I hope the committee would support me. We hope you're taking a common sense approach with the partners. You're doing the right thing by preparing us for all eventualities, and that you are not going to be blocked by what I think is some absurd approach. This blanket approach isn't what's required. And some further thinking needs to come out from government on this. I mean, we're very fortunate. Last time we were here, we had the NHS who were able to speak. I'm told they're now closing down again in terms of the cooperation. Is that something where you've requested information? Because my next questions goes on about who's part of what and how you're collecting data. Are public agencies interpreting much more rigidly than maybe a common sense approach that we would like in terms of protecting Londoners?
No, I don't think we resonate particularly with that in terms of an operational nature with the NHS engaging in London. I think they are entirely engaged and supportive of the London structures that we have in place now. They're an active member and have participated fully all the way through the process and continue to do so as we've moved into a response phase. So I understand where your points have come from. I think there is something within the government potential echelons of NHS and not wanting to have information leaked through different routes. I think that's part of the bigger problem in this, is that this is an entire infrastructure problem across every part of government, and therefore there are so many routes of information flowing around and different sources of interpretation that it is really difficult to get a single granular picture on any one issue because it has to go through so many routes and sources.
Right, well, thank you for that. Let's go on to some of the core questions that the committee have got. Can you brief us on the EU Exit Strategy Coordination Group, which sits under the LRF? Who's on it and what's it tasked with doing? Just take us through that.
Should I take that? The EU Exit Strategic Coordination Group it aims to ensure that the London Resilience Partnership can work together to coordinate an effective response to civil contingency matters arising from a no-deal Brexit. It's now up and running and is running to transition us from the preparation to a potential response phase. John Barradell is chairing the SCG with Eleanor Kelly, Chief Exec of Southwark Council, acting as Vice Chair, and John's team at the London Resilience Group provides the Secretariat. So we have daily SCG meetings scheduled, although because of the delay we have sort of stood down some of the meetings, and we've also put in place other flexible arrangements to share information. The London Resilience Group has also recruited a number of temporary staff to manage the Brexit reporting to government. Those are now recruited, trained and in place, and a number of agencies are also being asked to report into individual departments as well as through what we review as normal resilience structures. So, and as I mentioned last time we came and spoke to this working group, we are putting in place arrangements to make sure that as well as any potential disruption or incident relating to no deal, the partnership can also deal with what we might regard as normal incidents that could occur at any point in London.
And at our last meeting, we talked about the risks around food and fuel supplies to London. Has that position changed in the last month in terms of further work that you've done? I think we can include, if we know about medicine and medical supplies, what was told to us a month ago. Has the situation changed, or is it, we know there's a risk?
There's been no huge change in terms of the risk, in terms of the food. The closer we get to the growing season, that limits the risk in terms of fresh produce, albeit marginally. And I think the scale and the breadth of the supply chain issues and the borders issues, that some of which we heard about earlier, it really does maintain a real threat to us.
I mean, we're never going to be faced by these challenges ever again, but it does seem to me that we ought to learn some of the lessons of it. Are we collating stuff as you go along, with someone recording issues around saying, if we ever face this type of challenge again, God forbid, that we would, well, hopefully government might do something differently, but that we might do things differently. Is that going on?
We've had a number of discussions. We haven't formalised anything yet, but we will definitely be looking at what we can learn from the situation. I think one of the most striking issues, and the reason that we did set up the food subgroup, is that very quickly it became clear that food in particular, or supply chains generally, the just in time principle actually needs to be replaced a little bit with and a just in case. So we don't have any sort of real resilience beyond 2 or 3 days. Generally, that's a general issue. It's not just a London issue. So I think we'll definitely be looking more around sort of supply chains around food. And as part of the 100 Resilient Cities project, we're looking to pick up some of that. I think that hopefully we will be able to treat it as an exercise of how you can put in place coordination arrangements. Hopefully we won't have to sort of test them. But I think the partnership has also learnt a lot about what happens when structures that are designed for a individual incident or a short-term emergency are used for something that isn't yet an emergency. And I think we will be looking and hoping to have a proper and honest review with government about how we would need to look at changing arrangements, or sort of what would we need to do in the future should you have a period which has gone, I mean, it's since the end of July, beginning of August, all the partners are having to look at this. And actually, so is this and was this the right way to plan? I think we have got good structures in place now, but actually I think that we need to take the heat out of any kind of review so that we can have an honest review. The danger is because Brexit is so polarised as an issue that people in government sort of, that polarisation and decision not to talk openly, that I think comes from the sort of higher levels of government, not from sort of civil servants dealing with it. We need people to actually sort of set that to one side if we are really going to learn lessons from it properly, and without wanting to unduly sort of prolong the work of this working group. Actually, if we do get a deal and we do get a transition period, what you might see towards the end is a need to set up similar arrangements should there be some issues that haven't been resolved through negotiations during the transition period. So it is really important that we learn from what is happening now, so that if there are lessons to be learnt about coordination arrangements, and I think the previous guest did talk about sort of that information piece and making sure that during the transition period information flowed more freely where appropriate out of government and within government, which wasn't an issue that we were quite as aware of. But if no review is undertaken to identify where the blockages are in the short term, you would see that continuing, and we won't learn lessons that we could actually learn that would be useful over the next year or so.
And can you tell us what kinds of information government are asking you to collect for them in terms of our preparedness?
Yeah, so we have a daily reporting rhythm that we have instigated in London. So within London, we ask ourselves two questions, essentially. Firstly, is London okay? So are we as partners happy, and happy perhaps a wrong term, but are we content that organisations can deal with any disruptions within their own means? In terms of the information for government, then we're asked to look at the impacts on borders and ports, transport implications, energy, vehicle fuel, food, water, environment, health, social care, law and order, community tensions and financial services. So a broad range of areas to look at, some of which are easier said than done in terms of how do you assess the business impact or the financial services impact for a city such as London through the means of data collection that we have, and certainly how do you do that on a daily basis is extremely challenging. So we have processes in place to give our sentiment as best as we can, and they will complement other routes of information going directly into government and indeed their own analysis.
Caroline Pigeon.
Yes, I wanted to come on to the issue of business, and it seems to be a very mixed picture when you what you read in the press and when you hear businesses in terms of how prepared they are. Have you got any sense of the sort of planning, the contingency planning that businesses are doing, and whether it's, you know, firmed up over recent weeks?
I think there's business isn't just one sort of homogenous whole. So I think big businesses are probably able to better put the resources into contingency planning for a no deal. I think what we haven't seen much evidence of is that small businesses have been able to do the same. I think a lot of people have been waiting for certainty, and I think on a week by week basis, obviously all of us think that this week might be the week that we find out what's going to happen, and many small businesses simply don't have the reserves available to build up their stocks, and in any case that wouldn't be the option for small businesses that were dealing with food or for example food retailers or florists. And I think some of the incidents that have happened in London over the past few years have shown how vulnerable small businesses can be, and many might struggle with just a few days disruption. So if there were to be a no-deal scenario, we could see small businesses struggle to survive, and I think we would really be looking to government to actually step in and make sure that that they assisted small businesses to make sure we didn't lose substantial businesses to actually what isn't something that they could realistically have been expected to plan for or have the resources to put things in place in the same way that some of the bigger businesses might be able to.
So until there's actual certainty, and
Yes.
it's just laughable really, isn't it, at this stage, but until there's actual certainty, small businesses don't have the space to even cope with thinking, what would we do differently?
No, well, I spoke to an owner of a Scandinavian food import company, and she said that it was almost impossible for her to plan because she couldn't plan for all the different eventualities. Fresh food, even if she did have the storage space, she wouldn't be able to stockpile it or sort of get a buffer, and actually even one day's delay would potentially break her supply chain. So I think that's the sort of level people are looking at, actually, is that they might be able to become more aware of what issues they might face, but being able to actually put any mitigation in place as a small business with using fresh produce is actually much harder than it sounds. Yeah. So the key there would be to make sure we don't get a situation in which things get delayed coming through. Yeah. And that is actually the only mitigation which is outside small businesses' control themselves, but it is the only thing that would actually sort of help in sort of preventing that breaking the supply chain.
Okay, I wanted to get on to some specific sectors, and if I could just start with transport, TfL. Since the last meeting, we've heard that TfL staff have been put on alert for travel chaos caused by border disruptions, fuel scarcity and public disorder, particularly if there's a no-deal Brexit. And there was a leaked memo, I think, that's come out in the last few days that picks up this. It's particularly their staff in the high-tech control room. Are you aware of this? Have TfL relayed concerns to you? Are they working with you on this?
TfL are an absolute key partner in all of this. I haven't heard that term that they've been put on alert, and I think we discussed last time about the media piece about the ambulance service and their potential. So I think there's, you know, as always with the media, some sensationalisation around what is actually happening with this. TfL are working closely with all of their other transport partners. That they are providing us with a feed-in daily in terms of the capability and the capacity of the transport network, and we're working closely, or very closely, with St Pancras, Eurostar and Heathrow Airport as well, in terms of the travel disruption that we're expecting there. So from that perspective, we've been working through and have a high degree of confidence in their plans and their ability to deal with disruption around the borders area in particular.
Okay, well, we're going to come on to ports. One of my colleagues will pick that up, but just particularly in terms of TfL, so they're cancelling staff leave in this control centre for the next few weeks, and it's not just the border disruptions. They're concerned about panic buying of petrol at petrol stations, delays at airports, obviously, and street protests causing congestion. Is that the sort of thing that you are overall preparing for?
I mean, I think that what all organisations such as TfL will be doing is preparing and sort of planning through reasonable worst case scenarios, and all of the examples you've listed are sort of things that they should be thinking about how they would deal with that were it to happen in the context of a no deal. I think last time we talked about fuel shortages, and actually one of the things that would be most likely to cause a fuel shortage would be a panic being caused by an individual petrol station potentially having, I mean, I think most petrol stations at some point in the week have those sort of have pumps that haven't got fuel in. If you have that in the context of people feeling alarm in the context of a no-deal Brexit, that could quite easily and quite quickly lead to panic. And so people should be thinking through what might happen in those scenarios. It doesn't mean that is bound to happen, but a lot of the things that could happen, people really should think through as reasonable worst case scenarios.
Okay, so have you done any further work to assess sector specific risks? So you just touched on transport a bit, but utility sector since we last met.
So since we last met, we had the London Resilience Forum very shortly afterwards, and we spent a great deal of time there. That was the majority of the focus of the meeting, and asking individual sectors and agencies in terms of their assurance. We've continued to meet with the Brexit Contingency Planning Group as well, and now that we've moved into holding actual strategic coordinating group meetings, that is part of the purpose of that grouping, that it seeks the assurance, it helps to identify cross-cutting issues that people aren't able to work to themselves. So far we've had or had no impacts raised to us in terms of the SCG meetings, and we've been back around the houses as we can in terms of asking for individual agency assurances for the mitigations. I think we have to understand the scale, breadth and complexity of all of this is that we just don't understand what is going to happen. I think, you know, we are asking to run the country in a completely different way, and this isn't about contingency plans, as we said before. This is about how organisations will adapt to a new normal and put in place new systems, processes, and how quickly they can do that. And we need to see how they will manifest and emerge, whether we get a deal or no deal or whatever may happen over the next coming months.
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Caroline Russell.
Thank you. There's just one question that's actually not on our list here that I'd just like to pick up before I get started on the our main questions, which is that you've given a lot of confidence in terms of your preparedness for what may come out of a no-deal scenario, but I just wonder what impact all of this preparation for no deal and these various sort of unknown scenarios that we potentially face, what impact that's happening on the kind of core work on London's resilience around threats like climate change, which, you know, isn't going away, and whether all of that work is on hold at the moment, or whether there's the capacity to keep doing the sort of that bigger picture London resilience work.
Do you want to lead?
Yeah, so I think to kind of change a phrase slightly, life is what happens when we're all busy making plans, and all of that work needs to continue. So we have, as far as possible, maintained the basis or basics of our work programme, so that we can continue with a lot of that underlying work and trying to deliver on some of those. Without doubt, this has taken away resources from our ordinary planning. And this has taken a huge amount of headspace. And as you'll have seen in numerous newspaper articles, media releases, you know, that where they cite the civil service always being asked to plan for 2 eventualities. So we're being asked to plan for multiple eventualities in all of this, which takes up time, space, energy, and effort, which could be diverted to other resources.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where it comes back to the chair's point about what can we learn from this. We really do need to make sure that we do take learning from it, and that we don't just park it and say, thank goodness that's over, when we get through this phase, that we actually look at what we've learned and look at how that can improve our work on wider resilience. And I sort of mentioned the 100 Resilient Cities piece, but I think bringing in the extra staff to handle the reporting to government is what we've put in place through John's team, to make sure that the London Resilience Group and the partnership can still respond to other things. But obviously there's a lot of ongoing work that that Brexit has meant that it's slowed down a bit. But that's not to say we're not putting things in place. So, for example, a couple of times a year, the London Resilience Group put on strategic summits. There is one that is completely non-Brexit related coming up in the spring that will go ahead. And so projects that they're involved in are going ahead, albeit that some of the work around that may have been slowed down a bit by people understandably and rightly focusing on this immediate issue of the potential for no-deal Brexit, which both government and the Mayor understandably asked the Resilience Partnership to look at, and which has undoubtedly taken up a lot of time, not just on the part of John's team, but on behalf of the partners in the LRF.
Thank you. And then the other question that came out that I have, which comes out of the earlier session with Joe Owen, just whether you have any observations on London's readiness to actually hold EU elections if we find ourselves, you know, coming through what he described as the second pathway, which is the one that comes out of the indicative votes. If that takes us to a situation where the EU elections need to be held, is London ready to do that?
So I don't think that's directly for us to comment. That would be you'd have to ask those that hold the elections themselves.
So that would
I know
be the
those
local authorities.
Conversations are happening, and I think that the date of the 12th of April to announce that we will take part in those elections leaves it right to the wire in terms of enabling them to put in those preparations in place. So they are thinking about it now. There is dialogue.
There is dialogue about it.
There is dialogue between local government and central government, but I think, like everything at the moment, there is such uncertainty. How do people progress with any degree of clarity?
Yeah, well, it's reassuring to hear that there is at least some dialogue on that. Then you've touched on the ports and points of entry to the UK. Can you update us specifically on any work that's taking place around the ports of entry to ensure as free a flow of people and goods as possible in the event of a no deal?
Yeah, so the two main ports in London that we've focused with are Heathrow and St Pancras. That's not to say we haven't engaged with London City Airport, but they were deemed a lower risk potential because of the volume of traffic of passengers they have, etc. Heathrow, in terms of their movement of passengers, they have very good customer service preparations in place and have provided reassurance and have a team working solely on Brexit, and their Brexit director is engaged with us directly to the strategic coordinating group. They've also looked at their freight issues and the kind of equivocal knock-on impacts as we would see at Dover and on the Calais Straits as Heathrow would face. It's an entirely different scale and magnitude of issue there because they already transfer freight outside of the EU, so it's only a proportion of their business in that respect that would be changed. They've got extant plans in place. They put them into practice quite regularly, and they are assured that they will be able to deal and mitigate with those issues. We've also engaged with the surrounding counties on that, and also the transport authorities, local authorities and Metropolitan Police. So all of the relevant agencies have been engaged with Heathrow, have been extremely proactive in that work. Likewise, working with the border delivery group that Joe mentioned earlier in terms of putting in place the plans. They've been closely linked in with the work with St Pancras, and we meet them weekly at least in terms of their ongoing plans to mitigate against any excessive queues originating out of St Pancras. And you may well have seen over the last couple of weeks that due to the French industrial action, the delays that were put in place on the Eurostars and services and a number of trains cancelled each day, and we didn't see that spill out into a problem into London. So that provides us with some assurance in terms of the methods that Eurostar have in place to deal with people and their communications to their passengers work and will work into the future.
Thank you. Is there anything you want to add, Fiona, on that issue?
Not that point,
And then my final question is, what advice are you giving to the Mayor on the work that he needs to prioritise to ensure that London is resilient to any possible shocks from a no-deal exit?
I think we've basically been giving assurance to the Mayor around the arrangement. So at my regular meetings with the Mayor, I've talked through what we've got in place. He held a Mayor's advisory group about a month ago, a few weeks ago, on the 1st of March to discuss no-deal preparations. This meeting included the police, fire, transport commissioners, borough and NHS representatives, the MHCLG, the resilience team, as well as a number of deputy mayors. So I think the advice that's being provided to the Mayor is around the assurance piece, to give him assurance that the arrangements are in place, that partners are putting the work in, and that all the arrangements we need to make are in place. And as well as myself, the Mayor's Chief of Staff has been involved with and engaged with the strategic coordinating groups to ensure that there is that direct link from the SCG to City Hall and the Mayor, so that he gets that assurance that we are prepared, we have got things in place, and actually where we think there are risks, so for example around the food piece and around other issues, these are things that have been fed into the Mayor. Although some of these issues, unfortunately, he can't do a huge amount about. He has put in place information streams around business advice and advice to EU citizens where they've got some uncertainties around their rights post-Brexit.
So is that mainly focused on no-deal preparedness, or are you, because we heard from Joe Owen earlier about the kind of need for some real sort of structural changes in terms of how government works, and in terms of, you know, if we end up leaving with a deal, is there a conversation going on about you know, how the Mayor can support Londoners, support EU citizens, but also support businesses in terms of navigating, you know, these new processes that it appears, you know, that there's so little information being shared about how they're going to work that even government departments aren't communicating about it. So how Londoners can actually engage with what it is they need to be complying with and working with.
So the Mayor's obviously put a lot of work into, I mean, immediately after the referendum result, launched the London is Open campaign. Under that campaign, you've got a lot of information. You've got a web portal for EU citizens on signposting people towards information, doing quite a lot of engagement direct with EU citizens, which I think we'll see over the next few weeks. There's a business hub, which is an online web-based advice portal for businesses, and I know that the Mayor and particularly Rajesh Agarwal in his Deputy Mayor's capacity has also been engaging with and talking to businesses about what they need. Ultimately, the government has responsibility for sorting some of the issues out, and I think in terms of business in particular, the continued uncertainty has been particularly problematic, and obviously on an individual basis for EU or EEA citizens, the uncertainty is also unsettling. So I think part of the Mayor's role is obviously as sort of reassurance to business and to EU citizens, but also as a spokesperson on their behalf, linking into to government. I'll just go back to one point you made about sort of if there's a deal, indicating that that'd be the end of it, and just sort of make it clear that actually the deal is just on the framework for negotiations for what that will take place in the transition period. And actually, so I think what advice we have been giving to the Mayor, and what has been sort of I think at the heart of the planning from other teams within the GLA as well, is actually if we leave with a deal, that isn't the end of it, it's actually sort of the beginning of the next phase. And actually, as I said earlier, a lot of what we've learned, we will then want to apply and come back to in the next phase during the transition period, because we could end up back where we are in 18 months' time, not knowing how things are going to be the next day, let alone the next week, in terms of where we are with the negotiations. And it's that uncertainty that I think is the most damaging, and could actually because risks don't need to be real in order for them to have an impact. And I think that in some of the government planning and in some of the government rhetoric, there's been a lack of understanding that you can say, for example, that there won't be an overall shortage of food, there'll just be a lack of choice, but that does not translate into consumers or businesses feeling confident. Yeah. And I think that one of the things I've learned is actually there's a huge lack of trust in terms of how people view what information is coming out from government. And at every level of government within the country, we're going to have to work very hard to make sure that on some level we all work to restore that trust, to make sure that actually we move away from, because the constitutional crisis isn't just about Brexit, it's about the relationship between politicians and people and how they view how things are being managed. So I think it's so much more than just the words on a piece of paper or the treaty. It's about fundamentally how we are going to move forward as a city and as a country.
And I think the fact that we've seen the CBI and the TUC come together writing to express their concern about the gravity of the situation that we're in just shows it's, you know, people representing people who work and people representing the businesses, both equally worried and pairing up in a way that I think is probably unprecedented. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Tony, then Caroline.
Mine's very quick. I made it earlier, Deputy Mayor. Can you send us a flow diagram of who does what, at least in London, in due course, please?
I think
I think to try and put that together just for London would be a task in itself. I think we did something in terms of communication lines for the Olympics, and that filled an A0 sheet. We could potentially try, but I can't promise anything because I think it is extremely complicated.
I think if it's helpful, though, we could sit down with you at some point and talk through how things work in a bit more detail than is possible in this forum.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, Caroline?
I just want to pick up something actually from our last meeting, just see when we were discussing last time risk assessment, you told me you'd written to central government, Prime Minister, Ministry of Housing, Minister for Food Security, and were awaiting responses. Have you actually had any responses back from government to the issues you've been raising?
Well, I know that the letter that was sent by the Mayor didn't receive a response from the Prime Minister. We have had a response to a letter that I sent in combined with John Barradell as Chair and Deputy Chair of the London Resilience Forum. It took some time and actually I think that the issue for me was actually the letter had been leaked before we got a reply, so it felt like it was connected to the fact that it was clear that it hadn't had a reply, that we got the response back. And I think that it's the time that it's taken to get formal responses. John and his team and the partnership have very good relations with the civil servants we deal with. But they shouldn't be having to use sort of informal workarounds to get information. And it goes back to there should be clear sort of communication lines, and we should get quicker and more substantial responses to information. And I think that sort of information flow is still an issue. I don't think it's as I said before, it's not the civil servants who are at fault in our view, and it is that sort of intense rivalry between various personalities that is causing quite a lot of problems, but also a huge desire on the part of the government to restate and state that actually they are expecting to leave with a deal, which I think we got in a communication lines quite recently, that basically they're still sending people out sort of absolutely insistent that the government's priority is to leave with a deal. That might be the case, but actually in terms of communications with key partners who are planning contingency, that's not necessarily a helpful starting point for a discussion.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Can I thank you for the way you answer questions? I think we formally need to note the report and the discussion. Can you delegate authority to myself along with you people plus the group lead for the Conservative group to work out in terms of the outputs that we will? I feel that we may need to write to the Mayor on the last two sessions. I think there are two issues that come to mind. Certainly I think about making sure that we're keeping control over the monies and what we're spending and how those issues. I think we need to learn those lessons. But more importantly, this issue about the non-disclosure issues and its use and as a potential barrier to good work, I think, and good outcomes and keeping people safe. And so if that's enough brief for you to work on, we will come back to this issue, but thank you very much. Let's move on to item 6, date of the next meeting. Again, can I ask you to leave that for us to have some informal discussions? 19th of June is too long away. Things are moving fast. We might need to look at some closer dates, and we'll advise you of the guests that we might wish to do. I think there always will be a standing spot on this agenda for your good selves, and we'll try and keep it short because I think that those issues, but we'll try and organise the dates around your availability as well. That's item 6. Item 7, there is no any other urgent business. I declare this meeting closed.
GLA